Good morning and welcome to Rising. As always, we have a great show for you today. I'm Amber Duke, joined by Nomiki Konst. Nomiki, good to be back at the desk with you again today.
We are getting close here. Very exciting. Picking out my election outfit.
Officially 1 week out from Election Day at this point, and the mainstream media is breaking in the process. It all started when the LA Times refused to endorse a presidential candidate, and soon after, Jeff Bezos followed suit and blocked the Washington Post from giving an expected endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris. In the wake of the decision, the Washington Post lost roughly 200,000, or 8% of its subscribers. Bezos penned an op-ed late Monday that's title said it all. It read, quote, "The hard truth, Americans don't trust the news media." Explaining his decision, Bezos writes, "The media, quote, must be accurate and we must be believed to be accurate. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but we are failing on the second requirement. Most people believe the media is biased. Anyone who doesn't see this is paying scant attention to reality." He goes on to say, quote, "Presidential endorsements do nothing to tip the scales of an election. No undecided voters in Pennsylvania are going to say, 'I'm going with newspaper A's endorsement.' None. What presidential endorsements actually do is create a perception of bias." And he took a jab at his own paper, writing, quote, "The Washington Post and the New York Times win prizes, but increasingly we talk only to a certain elite. More and more, we talk to ourselves."
Bezos said that ending endorsements is a principled decision and that it'd be a meaningful step in gaining trust back. He added that no sort of quid pro quo with the campaign took place.
But it wasn't just the LA Times and Washington Post that refused to commit to a candidate. The USA Today network announced that it too wouldn't be making any presidential endorsement. Interestingly, the paper said that it would give discretion, however, to local editors to endorse at a state or local level. A USA Today spokesperson told The Hill, quote, "We believe America's future is decided locally, one race at a time. And with more than 200 publications across the nation, our public service is to provide readers with the facts that matter and the trusted information they need to make informed decisions. What does this mean for the Fourth Estate?" So, Nomiki, what do you think about, first of all, Jeff Bezos' op-ed in the Washington Post? I actually agree with the bulk of what he said in this op-ed, but I'm not sure I believe that that's really the reason why he has decided to not allow the Washington Post to endorse. I think it's more likely that these guys are kind of hedging their bets in case Trump wins. They don't want regulation on their industries. They don't want to have the same sort of tense relationship that Trump and Bezos infamously had during his first term. But he gave lip service, I thought, to the right ideas, which is that the mainstream media does have a trust problem right now, and it doesn't seem like the mainstream papers are doing much to fix that issue.
I mean, the media all around has a trust problem right now, as do politicians. I don't think just Jeff Bezos talking about how media caters to the elites as an elite, as the second richest man in the world, is going to solve it. I agree with you. I think that he's hedging his bets. The biggest concern, and I've talked to several folks who not just journalists, but people who cover the media over the last few days since this happened, and the biggest concern with media watchdogs is that it happened with no discussion, no discourse with the editorial team, no discourse with senior staff. He basically had a one-on-one, at least for the Washington Post, conversation with the executive editor and made the decision last minute. And if their excuse that suddenly we don't want to be making endorsements and changing the goalpost every time he's criticized, because 50 years ago they didn't make endorsements. Well, then why didn't you have that conversation 6 months ago when you were talking about election coverage? And I don't buy this thing that doesn't matter. I mean, in New York, and this is specifically New York elections. It's not presidential elections, but the New York Times endorsement, which they have decided to no longer make endorsements in the city, which is interesting, but they did at the presidential level. Those city-wide endorsements are incredibly consequential. I mean, they impact elections, certain neighborhoods. I mean, not all neighborhoods, but there are definitely neighborhoods that are high propensity, like New York Times readers, and they're influenced, and that definitely appears in the polls in the lead up to those elections. So I think it just depends, and maybe that's what USA Today was getting to with local papers. And I mean, that's a smart take. Again, why are you doing it a week before the election? Have this conversation openly. Have it with your team, your news team. They own the papers, so they have the ultimate choice at the end of the day. But it definitely would look better if they had some sort of discourse with their team.
Yeah, the timing is what makes me think that this is sort of a CYA moment too, because it could have happened a lot sooner. they waited until the polls started to tighten pretty significantly, and Trump is leading in some of the 7 swing states, looking really good in the Rust Belt, the Sun Belt, while Kamala is actually overperforming in the Rust Belt. But I do think, for a broader point, outside of Jeff Bezos' particular involvement in this, the media has a significant problem. And one of those problems is that they do cater exclusively, almost, to a wealthy, overeducated, coastal elite subscriber base. And I think you see people canceling the Washington Post in response to this decision, not because out of any principled objection to Jeff Bezos, but because they're upset that the paper's not telling them what they want to hear. And increasingly, reporters themselves, journalists, are cultivated from elite universities. They don't look representative of the American population. And as a result, most Americans read these papers and say, that doesn't sound anything like the reality that I'm living in.
I think the truth is that we've had an assault on newspapers since the economic crash, since 2008, 2009. We have seen the majority, I think it's like 80% of local newspapers, state house papers, get completely eviscerated across this country. So I don't think it's about that the Washington Post, the New York Times, or the LA Times catered to elites. I think that they catered to their communities. So the New York Times is the paper of record in New York, and the Washington Post is for Washington, and the LA Times is for LA. But there are communities across this country that don't have newspapers anymore. And so I don't think it's an elite question. I think it's a question of we just don't have a thriving media anymore. And of course, big business has jumped in, and hedge funds, and you see this consolidation of media that's really giving a more corporate take. I hear what you're saying about educated folks, but that's not the majority of people in newsrooms. I mean, you and I both know plenty of reporters who came out of state house beats. They came from state schools. In New York City alone, I can name 10 or 15 of them that work at the New York Times that did so. But it's also duplicitous, I think, because you look at the Washington Post and they're also doing local elections. I mean, it's just, which way is it? Do you want to endorse candidates or do you not? The editorial side is the editorial side. They have an opinion, and I think that's why you have that firewall in the newsroom between news and editorial. But at the end of the day, it shouldn't be. People should have access to information, and my concern is that the state of media is in such a crisis at this point that it really is a dark sign for the fourth estate and the sign of our democracy really in decay.
I guess my pushback on that would be that if people are not trusting the media, is the problem with the people or the media? And I think the problem is with the media, because the people largely haven't changed. Our country ideologically really hasn't changed that much. People still mostly stand on the issues where they stood 20, 30 years ago. It's just that the papers have seemingly coalesced more around a liberal ideology. And I actually wrote a book on this topic. It's called The Snowflakes Revolt, and I did research into who sits in newsrooms. It actually is true that they are overeducated when compared to the rest of the American population, and very few of them at these elite papers do come from state schools. In fact, if you look at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, they are on the educational par of Supreme Court justices and senators.
What about the Arizona Republic? What about the Texas Tribune? What about all these citywide papers? I would disagree with you on that. And cherry picking 3 papers in New York City. That's the Wall Street Journal, which caters to business. Of course, you're going to have a more educated group of folks. Of course, you're going to hire a reporter who probably has a college degree. I mean, it's not always the case, but that's likely to happen because that's the type of work they're doing.
It's not just a college degree, though. It's that they went to Yale, Harvard, Ivy League schools in general. They're the papers that are read the most. They have the largest subscriber base.
Because we don't have papers in this country anymore. So it is a crisis of media. With that, we could have this conversation all day long. You wrote a book on it, but we have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this.